You're listening to Inside the Village, where all news is local and no topic is off limits.
So help me, Bob, it's bully in the alley. Hey, bully in the alley. So help me, Bob.
Welcome to Inside the Village, brought to you by True North Mortgage. True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash. You can find them online at truenorthmortgage.ca. With Michael Friscolanti, editor-in-chief at Village Media, I'm Scott Sexsmith. Here we are. Happy post-Thanksgiving. Good to see you. It's good to be here. It's good to be seen.
Yes, it is, absolutely.
What's new? What's been going on? You're laughing. What are you laughing at?
We have to talk about the Blue Jays, right, Scott?
Yeah. Do we really have to talk about the Blue Jays?
You didn't stop talking about them for months and months. I think we need to finish off.
Yeah. I'm not going to lie. It was a colossal collapse, and I think calling it anything short of that is wrong. Now, we should mention that you're not the biggest Blue Jays fan.
No.
In fact, you're a Tigers fan.
Yeah, nothing personal against the people who run the Blue Jays or play for the Blue Jays, but since I was a little boy, I have despised the Blue Jays. I've been a Tigers fan. My dad, God bless him, went to Detroit for a conference when I was 7 years old, and he came home with a couple Tigers pennants, a poster of Alan Trammell and Lou Whitaker, and that was it. And the Jays were on the radio where I grew up, and so I would listen to them just to hear the out-of-town scoreboard.
It had nothing to do with Tom Cheek and Jerry Howard.
They were great. They called a good ball game, but I do not like the Blue Jays. Was not happy when they won back-to-back World Series. So the only thing better for me than a Tigers win is a Blue Jays loss, and man, did they lose.
In your wildest dreams, did you ever envision up 8-1 in the sixth inning?
The 6th or 7th, I think it was.
That they were going to lose.
When they hit the 3-run homer to make it 9-5, I looked at my son and I said, they're going to win this game. The momentum's totally shifted. You felt the air, the wind go out of their sails after that. And it's just inevitable they were going to lose that game. Yeah,
a couple things. And look, it's easy for us to sit back here, a few days removed and be an armchair quarterback or a backseat driver. The things that seem to be being said the most, that Schneider pulled Gausman one batter too soon. Mm-hmm. And the thing that really shifted the momentum was Bo Bichette chasing a ball that he had no right to chase, getting in Springer's way. That's a center fielder's call. That's not Bichette's call.
But isn't that the beauty of baseball, right? We chew yesterday's breakfast, as the great Jim Leland would always say, right?
Absolutely.
That's the beauty of baseball. Well, I shouldn't have pulled this pitcher. Well, that's the game, right?
Yeah.
Or I shouldn't have chased that ball. The game's on the line. The Jays' season's on the line. Bichette's running for that ball. What's he going to do? I mean, maybe in a regular season game he wouldn't have had all out there, but it's so easy to second-guess baseball because it's played like a game of chess, right?
Absolutely.
And you think, oh, man, I shouldn't have done that.
Absolutely. Now, I will say this. If Bichette stays in his position and lets Springer get that ball, even if the ball drops, only one run scores, not three, and they don't collide.
No, it's true.
But again, it's so easy.
But you could do that all day with baseball. You can go back to the third inning, the second inning, The Jays shouldn't have lost game 1 4-0 either.
Well, look, you can do it with baseball. You can do it with any sport. And Sid Cicero, formerly of Sportsnet, now of Breakfast Television in Toronto, had a great rant earlier this week. And I think he hit the nail on the head that change has to happen because of this collapse. Look at the Maple Leafs. Time and time again, they fold like a cheap tent. Nothing happens. Dubas is still there. Shanahan is still there. There is no change. And what message does that send? And Sid's point is, you go through this, you had an 8-1 lead, you were on the verge of pushing this to a third and deciding game, and you have this kind of collapse. Something has to happen to send a message.
But then if that game happened again today, you're going to have Romano, one of the best closers in the game. You're going to put him in they put him in the 8th inning to get 6 outs for them, right?
Yeah.
You would do that same move again. Would you want to now blow up the team and not have him as your 9th inning guy? I mean, you can argue that both ways, right? Baseball's a funny game, and it kills you, right? And then the idea that you can just blow it all up now and think the Jays will be back there next year, I don't know. They're a great team. I think they're the 4th in wins in the league in the last 4 years. I mean, they win every season. Playoffs are a whole different beast. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's, what's not fair is people crapping all over Toronto sports teams and the city of Toronto. Losers can't get it done. But I think what people fail to remember is 2019 Raptors win an NBA championship. Toronto FC wins their championship. Blue Jays in 2015 and 2016 make it to the postseason. So it's not all doom and gloom in Toronto.
No, I think they've done okay the last couple of years. They've had some things to cheer for. I think the Leafs ramp it up. They amplify it to degrees that are unseen anywhere else, right?
Best line that I saw is, "This is what happens when you let a Maple Leaf throw out the ceremonial first pitch.
Yep.
It's a curse."
Did they really do that? Who threw out the first pitch?
Austin Matthews. It was downhill from then on.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that.
We shall leave that debate for another day. Hockey season is upon us, so maybe in 6 or 7 months we'll be talking about another epic collapse.
Maybe.
Out of the big smoke. In the meantime, the first word to Frisco, you and the editorial and reporting staff here at Village Media continue to do some tremendous work, some great stories this week. A couple of that caught my eye, a coyote chase in Newmarket.
Yeah, this was a wild story, right? Coyotes are taking over cities, it feels like. Every day there's a headline about a coyote and what we're going to do about coyotes. And I get there was a lady in Newmarket out for her morning jog, and this coyote chased her, was basically jogging with it for half a kilometer. And she was just petrified, right? And our Joseph Quigley, one of our great reporters at Newmarket, told the story of her. And it just really brings it home for what's happening here. And it's in cities all over the place where you're dealing with this. But can you imagine going for a jog? Not that I've ever jogged, but could you imagine going for a jog? And
you got it out of your mouth before I could out of mine.
I know. And there's this coyote running beside you. Just a great piece.
A Collingwood nursing home is back in the news.
Yeah, we told you about this before, the Sunset Manor. It's the only nursing home, the only long-term care facility in Ontario that's not allowed to have new patients,
right.
new residents, because of a bunch of inspections that have not gone their way, provincial inspections. They're not up to code. So this has been in place for more than a year. The twist of the story was that Collingwood Today first reported, Eric Engel, a couple months ago, was that the county of Simcoe, which runs this nursing home, took the province to court, alleging basically that the only reason they had all these bad inspections was because the inspector was a former employee that they had fired. So they tried to go to court and argue this. They had, hundreds of pages of court documents. I can only imagine the thousands of dollars in taxpayer legal bills that the county of Simcoe paid. And last week, they lost. So the court said, no way, that's not the reason. The order's in place because you need to pick up your game and get these inspections on the right side. So just some great reporting from Collingwood Today. And just that's a kind of story that if you live in Collingwood right now, you have an elderly parent you're trying to put into care.
Yep.
There's 50 empty beds at this place because they're not allowed to have any new residents. So it's the kind of reporting that means something that actually impacts people's lives there.
And a city councillor in Thorold in some legal troubles facing a new lawsuit.
Yeah, this story just came out as we speak today, just about an hour ago. Jim Handley is a longtime city councillor in Thorold. Bernard Landsbergen, our reporter there, got a tip that he was being sued by an elderly couple who Jim had run over with his pickup truck a few years ago. They were rushed to hospital. The actual accident scene made news at the time. It was a pretty serious collision. And they're suing him for $3.4 million. The case is winding its way through court, so Bernard pulled the court files and is telling the story of what's happened here. Of course, it comes at an election time. That just happens to be the timing, but this is he's facing these legal troubles, and the question is, for him is, was he driving in a negligent way, as the lawsuit alleges? Was he not? And also, would we have to be on the hook personally for some of these damages? $3.4 million is a lot of money. A lot of people's auto insurance wouldn't have that kind of liability coverage.
Exactly.
So lots of unanswered questions, but definitely Jim's the kind of guy. He's a controversial city councillor. He's done some things that's made headlines, so the people in Thorold are very interested in what's going on with him in this case.
All right, thanks. The first word to Frisco, and 3 great stories that the editorial staff is following, as we will as well follow along. Coming up, Inside the Village returns after this, brought to you by True North Mortgage. True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash. We're back after this.
From newsmakers to celebrities to other prominent guests, you'll find them all on Village Media's new interview series, Up Close and Personal. Join host Scott Sexsmith as he goes one-on-one with well-known Canadians to hear their story. Up Close and Personal. Look for it on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
We're back on Inside the Village, brought to you by True North Mortgage. True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash. Find them online at truenorthmortgage.ca with Michael Friscoletti, editor-in-chief at Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith. A court challenge happening this week that has caught a lot of people's attention.
Yeah, a lot of headlines over the group of sex workers is in Toronto court arguing that prostitution laws, criminal laws that prohibit prostitution, are unconstitutional. They violate the charter. They make for unsafe working environments. And basically it's time to legalize sex work in the country. A lot of fascinating legal arguments made. A lot of people are behind this, and a lot of people also reading about it concerned whether this is the right direction we need to be going. So it's a conversation I think that we need to be having.
And we're going to have it right now with Jenn Clamen. Jenn is the national coordinator of the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform. Jenn, welcome to Inside the Village. It's great to have you with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Now, you've been an advocate for sex workers for a long time. Can you tell us what your organization does?
The Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform, we have actually been in existence not for as long as most of our member groups, but we started in 2012 at the height of the Bedford case, which was a case that was making its way up to the Supreme Court with 3 sex workers who were suing the government for breach of their human rights and fundamental human rights because of 3 prostitution laws at the time. So many of our we have 25 member groups across the country. Those member groups are run predominantly by sex workers, for sex workers, and there's a few choice allied groups in there. So together, our 25, I think actually it's about 26 groups now, across the country, we work together on law reform issues, so specific to sex work laws or laws that regulate sex workers' lives. But individually, those groups have existed for some more than 30 years, providing frontline services to sex workers in different communities across the country.
Thanks for that, Jenn. Obviously, the reason we wanted you to come in and chat with us today is everyone's been reading about the court challenge that went on last week involving your organization. But just a little background on that. Essentially, like you had mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court struck down criminal prohibitions against prostitution back in 2013, and the Harper government came back with a new set of laws. Can you explain that as best you can, just to our listeners? We'll start with that. What did the Harper government do after the Supreme Court struck down the law?
Yeah. So that Supreme Court case was a very big case. It was a huge shift in the recognition of sex workers' fundamental human rights. And it struck down 3 major prostitution provisions. And the courts at the time gave Parliament a year to figure out what to do. They didn't need to do anything per se. There's other things that they could have done than what they did do, but they decided to put together a new set of criminal provisions that actually at its heart really flew in the face of the decision in Bedford, because the decision in Bedford was about recognizing the harms of criminal law on the lives of sex workers, safety and health of sex workers. And the new government bill that Harper government put forward at the time was to make, for the first time in Canada, the sex work exchange illegal. Sex work hadn't been illegal before that. Different parts of it were illegal in order for sex workers to keep themselves safe. But this new regime called the PCPA, what was C-36 and became the PCPA, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, made the sex work exchange illegal for the first time. They claimed it was based on this idea of a Nordic, I prefer the word regime to model, because it's not a model legislation. But they claimed it was based on that model that would criminalize clients and decriminalize sex workers. That was sort of how they packaged it. But what the bill did instead was it criminalized sex workers for selling services in public space, and it added a whole bunch of new criminalizations that criminalized the purchase of sexual services in any context. And that also criminalized third-party involvement, and that also criminalized advertising. So sex workers are still working and living in a regime that very much puts their health and safety in danger because they're working in a criminalized context.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. And I think a lot of people maybe who don't understand this issue like you do, they read about this court challenge, they see the headlines, and they wonder, what is it about the criminalization of sex work that makes it so dangerous for sex workers? Mm-hmm. What's the motive for this court challenge, I guess, is the obvious question.
That's a great question. I think for sure people who don't live or work in a criminalized context, and also people who aren't racially or socially profiled by police every day or by law enforcement, people who live otherwise a very privileged or sort of normalized life, which is the majority of people, wouldn't necessarily understand the gravity of what it means to be living and working in a criminalized context. But if you can imagine that a criminalized context and criminality or criminalization actually ensures in certain ways that police and law enforcement are emboldened to be in the lives of people. And those people end up being people who are already overly policed and underprotected. So Indigenous communities, Black communities, trans communities, migrant communities, people who use drugs, people who live and work in public space are people who are already surveilled and already underprotected. And so these sex work provisions essentially invite police into the lives of sex workers when your work is is illegal, you are avoiding that law enforcement. And so in order to avoid law enforcement, because you don't want your clients being arrested, you need to make your money. You don't want third parties arrested because they're your partners, they're your friends, they're your community. They're people who help you get work. You're avoiding that detection. And so you're working in environments that are not necessarily safe. You're doing everything you can to avoid detection, to be what I guess some people would call underground. And in any context, I think what people maybe can understand, people who don't live in or work in a criminalized context can understand, is that when you don't have community, when you're unable to form community, when you're unable to let people know where you are and why you're there, you're isolated. And that isolation can have grave circumstances. It's why people have cell phones. It's why people have community. It's why people have friends and family. And so if you can't establish those mechanisms, it invites danger. And even more so than that, what it does is send a message to predators who are seeking out vulnerable communities who they know don't have access to those supports for violence, and that is what ends up happening as well.
For sure, and it's that idea too. That imagine going to work every day knowing that what you do is is considered a crime, and that you're trying to do it underground. You're trying not to be noticed. It just makes it a more dangerous situation.
That's right. I mean, there's the physical danger that is possible, but there's also things like you not being able to work from an indoor location and being at risk of eviction. There's other effects of criminalization as well, about having your children taken away from you, having your straight job being taken away from you. So there's physical violence, but there's also these other effects that are equally important.
Just in the vein of decriminalization, and you and I were talking about this upstairs, what in a perfect world, what does that look like? We service a lot of small towns across the Village network. So if it is decriminalized, what does that look like in a small community?
Good question. When people hear, lay people hear the term decriminalization, they get really scared. They're thinking, oh, sex workers want all these other things. And just a reminder, that this movement,
the right to earn a living, they're so,
yes.
But it's not even that. Like, that's the thing. It's people are in the sex worker rights movement are really just fighting for the right to not, at this stage anyways, although people would fight for the right for a living, they're actually just fighting for the right not to be harmed. And so we're just sort of working from like a negative rights perspective, not a positive rights perspective. But people who hold a lot of power and privilege get very scared when they think of marginalized communities getting access to some of that power and privilege, to bring themselves to more equal, like an equal plane in the world. That becomes very scary for people. So they hear the word decriminalization, they think, what's going to happen? There's going to be a brothel in every corner, and all the children are going to be, all these fears. What it would mean, decriminalization, is that sex work would no longer be considered a criminal activity. It would be regulated by things like occupational health and safety and employment standards and public health. And sex workers would have access to labor rights and to labor standards. And so when there are cases of exploitation that actually really flourish in an underground, unregulated market, as other informal labor sectors do, sex workers would have access to mechanisms to address that. In New Zealand, when sex work was decriminalized in 2003, sex workers now are able to address sexual harassment they experience at work. There was one sex worker who went to a human rights tribunal and was awarded $250,000 for the sexual harassment she was experiencing. And that wouldn't have been possible in a criminalized industry, because in a criminalized industry, everything is considered, at least in a Canadian context, everything is considered exploitation. So when sex workers experience actual exploitation, it just gets lumped in with everything else. And so they don't actually have the mechanisms to address what it is that's going on. So the way that our members of our alliance define decriminalization is really holistic. It's about removing the criminal framework for sex work, first of all, and using laws of general application to address sexual assault, coercion, confinement, all of these laws that exist within the criminal code, using those when sex workers experience those violences. And then looking sort of more provincially at labor frameworks and occupational health and safety frameworks and public health frameworks, and then looking municipally at things like policing and education and housing, and really all together, that's what decriminalization looks like, because the criminal code is a huge barrier for sex workers, but there are so many other barriers that stem from this belief that sex work is wrong and it's criminal and it should be eradicated. And so decriminalization is a much more broad project, to first start with removal of the criminal laws, but then to provide sex workers with supports that they need in order to live in health and safety as well.
To the rational person, that all makes total sense. I think you hit it on the head, this idea that I think the reason politicians haven't got behind this rational idea is because there's people out there who do have the stigma, who don't believe, do fear a brothel on every corner, and God forbid that we decriminalize sex work. That just to them would be shocking.
Yeah.
Is that the big hurdle here?
It's one of the hurdles. I think there was an explicit mention from the Liberal Party in 2015 when they came into power the first time of this sort of two-term thing, that they're in, when they were actually very much against the PCPA, the current laws, and they promised at the time to vote against them, which they never did. Of course, they voted against them as they were moving their way through the House and the Senate, but they never actually did anything once they were elected into power. But they said explicitly to us that they didn't, a few members in private obviously said explicitly to us that it wouldn't be so good for them to be the pot party and the brothel party at the same time. And so for sure there's a stigma attached to what this would mean. But if you look at the evidence, and I think people have a hard time doing that because a lot of the conversation around sex work and how it gets conflated with human trafficking is very much a conversation that is intended to pull at the heartstrings of people. And when that happens, people have less capacity to look at the evidence. And the evidence of a decriminalized industry is not that people are flocking to the sex industry in much the same way people don't flock to other industries that are permitted. They don't just flock. Sex work is not for everybody. There are many skills attached to it that people don't necessarily consider. It's just not what happens. And there aren't brothels on every corner in the same way there's not strip clubs on every corner. It's actually really hard to get a strip club license. So there's licensing involved. There's different regulatory systems involved. So a lot of it is fear. A lot of it is the way that the media portray sex work. A lot of it's very rampant, this idea about what the sex industry is and the fears around it and relationships to organized crime, etc. So there's most definitely it's very alive, that stigma and those misinterpretations, and that's definitely something that political parties feed into. They're just people, politicians. They're not experts in much, right? They're just elected people to make decisions. So they are stuck on that for sure. And there's also a moral component to it that is very, very patriarchal, and this belief that people need to be regulated by the criminal code and their bodies need to be regulated. That is a very old notion that is not specific to sex work alone.
You mentioned the one thing that sort of makes me think when I think about this, is the human trafficking aspect of it, right? If we decriminalize sex work, how do we ensure that 13-year-old girls or 13-year-old boys are not, trafficked into this industry? Will it help? Because that's my fear. If there's no one looking out for the criminal aspect of this, because no one wants to hear about that aspect. If it's a consenting adult who wants to be a sex worker, or an adult wants to be that's great. That's the business he or she wants to run. But this is where I'm confused.
Sure. Well, there isn't a human trafficking aspect to sex work. The sex work exchange is someone offering sexual services and someone paying for those sexual services.
Sure.
In some industries that are unregulated, like the sex industry or agricultural industry or live-in caregiver industries, there are people who experience what might be defined legally as human trafficking. But that doesn't exist as an aspect of the labor itself. It exists because of the lack of regulation in the industry and the laws that control the people in the industry. The reason that sex workers in our alliance wanted to go to court to challenge these laws are because these laws are not protecting sex workers against exploitation or against violence. And some of the sex workers who testified in our case talk about moments when they've experienced what they understand as human trafficking, but other moments when they experience what they understand as sex work. And the problems with these laws are that they actually label everything as exploitation. And there's a ton of resources going in to monitoring and surveilling the sex industry, and actually not areas of where people are experiencing exploitation or violence or what could be called human trafficking. And so if we didn't have the regulation of the entire industry, that we would be more easily able to detect exploitation and human trafficking. So I think that's where people get confused. They're like, there's not going to be any monitoring of exploitation. And it's the exact thing that we're claiming that sex workers want, is monitoring of exploitation, and is that protection instead of an overall ban. Right now, all of the human trafficking funds go into training hotel and taxi and airport staff to detect human traffickers or people who are being trafficked. But those sort of red flags that they teach people are often racist in nature. They don't necessarily get at the heart of what's happening. You're not going to. It's an odd construction of this notion of human trafficking, and it's not detecting, it's not helping to detect, nor is it helping to protect. The net is being cast way too large, I think, is one way of saying it.
Mm-hmm. Jen, how do you feel the court challenge went in Toronto?
It is a really messy way to do activism, to go through the courts. The criminal law and the court system is a blunt tool. It is hard to translate sex workers' needs into legalese and capture the nuance of people's realities. So I think that it is always important for legal activism to be accompanied by social activism. And we have had so much support from community, from allies in the case and outside of the case. And that's been really important. I think the court system doesn't allow for sex workers' realities to be centered. It's a game of formulas, and it's odd. It's an odd game. I think that there's really important evidence before this judge. There's 12,000 pages of evidence before this judge, and he has to very carefully center that and be very careful to not fall into some of the moral conversations himself that he has in his own head and with his own experience in the court system. So I don't have an easy answer for how it went. I can say that it's a difficult process. It's a huge waste of resources for our community in a context where this government, all they need to do is propose a bill around decriminalization and sit with us, because that's what would happen anyways at the end of the Supreme Court conversation. It is insulting. It is shocking that the government is contesting this challenge, that they're putting so much resources into contesting it. When you look at the interveners on the side of the applicants, that's us. When you look Amnesty, Black Legal Action Clinic, LEAF, Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, Ontario Coalition for Rape Crisis Centers, the BCC, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, when you go through all the different organizations who've intervened, it is shocking that the government would contest that. All these human rights organizations, and the Crown didn't bring forward one shred of evidence from people working in the industry. And so it's a bit shocking to see how this is playing out, but I mean, it's not surprising.
The sad part is it's actually shouldn't be shocking at all, right? As someone, I've covered the courts for so long. No, you're right. It is shocking, but it's really not shocking, because this is what governments do all the time. Whenever there's a court challenge about something that makes total sense, they will rather fight for years and years, because this fight will go, however it lands in the first court, it'll go to the Appeal Court of Ontario, it'll go to the Supreme Court, and in the end you'll be doing basically what you said you'd be doing. If everyone would just come to the table and talk it through and figure out the best way forward, you'd save a lot of money, you'd save a lot of time, and you would get the action that you need. What's your message to the people who are on your side with this, Jen, in terms of the timeline? Because you're right, this is a long grind, this is going to be, right? So no one should be thinking that in a week there's going to be a judgment from this court and everything's going to be great.
No, I think the judge actually said between 6 and 12 months. So it's going to be quite a while. Wow. We have eternal gratitude for people who've done the work and listened to the voices and experiences of people in the sex industry. Much of the Crown's argument in this case is to dismiss the complexity of the realities of sex workers in the case. And so they're arguing that the sex workers in this case are sort of, they're framing the sex workers in this case as privileged, but these are thousands of sex workers who are telling their stories of violence that are documented in our evidence. And so to cast that aside as being privileged, as opposed to being, these victims in real need of saving, and then there's these sex workers who have the choice, who aren't harmed by the laws, is dismissive at best, but it's very insulting to people. And so I think what we need people to do in this moment is to actually really listen to people and not try to determine, does this person have a choice, and how much of a choice do they have, and to compare sex workers' experiences together, because people do that all the time when they're trying to be convinced of something. They try to match it with what they have in their head. And that is really how stigma functions, is, oh, she's too stoned, or she's not stoned enough, or she's too smart, or she's not smart enough, and they sort of decide whether or not to actually believe and whether this human in front of them is deserving of having their rights respected. And I really discourage people to do that. And I encourage people to unknow what they think they know and to listen to what sex workers are saying. And this has been now 50 plus years, sex workers have been saying that the law is actually not protecting them. And and they do want protection, they just don't want it through the form of criminal law.
I'm glad we were able to have this conversation, because it's comments like that people can listen to and understand, that go beyond the headlines, or that they can listen to. Is there anything else we didn't ask you today, Jenn? If you want, or anything you want to say to someone who's is new to this issue and maybe is thinking, oh, I don't know if I support this, what would you say to them?
I mean, I would repeat what I just said.
Yeah.
And that's by saying unlearn what you think you know, and invite yourself into a conversation, or to thinking where you might not think people think their opinions are worth something. Everybody thinks they have this right to an opinion, but they don't. People's opinions don't matter. It doesn't matter what you think about sex workers. It matters that the person in front of you is having their rights respected. And so I invite people into that, and into thinking that their opinion might not matter if it has no impact on their lives.
Jenn Clamen, the National Coordinator of the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform. Jenn, keep fighting the good fight, and thanks for doing this today.
Such a pleasure. I appreciate the good conversation.
She had my heart, oh, very nearly.
For the latest in in-depth features and enterprise journalism from your local writers at Village Media, be sure to check out The Big Read. The Big Read. It's the full story behind the headlines. Look for The Big Read on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
So help me, Bob, it's bully in the alley.
Back to wrap on Inside the Village, brought to you by True North Mortgage. Okay, did you know this?
I know nothing.
That's not true. You know a lot of things. This, my friend, is episode number 20 of Inside the Village.
20.
20.
That is mind-boggling. I did not know that. I'm not keeping track very close, but that's something.
Well, thankfully, Derek, our executive producer, is indeed keeping track of those things, because it slipped both your mind and mine.
So that means our episodes have reached our listenership. Don't we have like 20 downloads?
Yeah. See, and you thought you wouldn't say anything witty. You always have something to say.
You know, I'm just kidding. People are listening, and we've given some shows. People are listening. We're up there. You know,
yeah,
it's nice.
We track the analytics, and much to both of our surprise, people are watching and people are listening and people are engaging and giving us great feedback, good and bad. You know what? And they're both just as good. You know. It's keeping the conversation going about local journalism and the great work that you and your staff continue to do across our network.
And we're learning a lot as we go about this. And it has been, that's what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to do two things, I think. We're trying to talk about some of the great local journalism we're doing and just highlight that, because maybe it was missed, people didn't hear about it, or maybe someone in a different market didn't know about that story that ran. And I think secondly, we're trying to have conversations about important issues and stories that impact people all over the province, like the one we just had today, right?
Absolutely.
If sex work is legalized in Canada, what does it mean for our communities in Ontario? What does it mean for Orillia or for Sault Ste. Marie or for Sudbury? These are important conversations to be having, and I think they impact people in our communities.
Well, here's to episode 20, and here's to hopefully another 20 more. And the best part about it is, you know, every week the three of us get to hang out in this cool studio for a couple of hours and I think do some pretty good stuff.
Absolutely.
All right, Inside the Village. If you've yet to download or subscribe, you can do so wherever you would get your favorite podcast. You can check us out at insidethevillage.ca and, of course, across the Village Media Network. For Editor-in-Chief Michael Friscolanti, Executive Producer Derek Turner, who you never see, we should actually shine the camera on Derek one of these weeks.
With the Sasquatch episode we did.
That's right. Yes, the beard.
That's enough. We can't have two guys with a crazy, stupid beard.
That's true. Executive Producer Derek Turner, I'm Scott Sexsmith. We'll talk to you next week.
You've been listening to Inside the Village.
Frisco and Scott's Wardrobe, provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.